Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. We're happy to have you this evening, and we're going to be talking with Adam Smith tonight. He is an applied climatologist for NOAA, and one thing that you've probably remembered from years past by watching our show here on YouTube or listening to the podcast version is we discuss the billion-dollar climate disasters that happen each year. And so with that, we're bringing a new perspective tonight. As of late July, NOAA is using a new interactive way where you can kind of really dive into your own community and see what impacts from these disasters hit in your area. So, with that, Adam is our guest tonight. Adam's helped kind of release some of this information. And, Adam, one thing that we like to ask folks before who's never been on our show before, kind of how you got into the weather world. So we'll give you that opportunity to kind of tell us about your weather story, and then we'll kind of get into the main part of the interview. But want to give you that opportunity to kind of tell us your history and your background here in the weather community.
Like a lot of people, weather has been a fascination since I was a kid. I grew up in Hickory, North Carolina, so got to have the experience of Hurricane Hugo back in 1989. I remember being stuck at my friend's house for about a week when Superstorm 93 came through, and we got a couple feet of snow and just the wind from that. And, all the major weather and climate extremes you remember as a kid. I went to North Carolina State University. I got a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology there. Did some also, I've always been an interdisciplinary type thinker. So not just the physical sciences, but minor in economics and communications as well. Then I went to graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill and did some geography work. And then was hired at National Climatic Data Center postgraduate school in late 2004, I believe. And I've been really just moving around there from the director's office to doing in situ observations and extremes within the weather and climate monitoring part of NCDC at the time, but now it's the National Centers for Environmental Information. And back in 2008 or so, I was engaging with different sectors, understanding how they use NOAA's data. So the insurance and reinsurance community in particular, understanding their industry, how they use data from the government, also what we can learn from them. And kind of reinvented this product that had been sitting around for a while, the billion-dollar weather and climate disaster. So made some partnerships with the private sector, coupled kind of the best public sector and the best private sector data, wrote several peer-reviewed papers on this with the algorithms and the analysis we do. And really since that time, it's just kind of been growing in fits and starts, adding new features as we learn how other users might like different types of information, and bring it to this day where, we've tried to focus on the county level and the census tract level risk maps with our partners at FEMA, at CDC, at Census, and really trying to bring almost a neighborhood level of granularity to the risks we all face in terms of weather and climate extremes.
It's really cool. For those who are watching or listening, I had no idea Adam's from Hickory. I live in Morganton, so I'm like basically neighbors. So a little coincidence there. You kind of surprised me when you said that. I was like, oh, I didn't know that. So really cool to have a fellow Foothill folk here on the show tonight. Adam, looking over some of the data that's been released with this newest update, just one thing that I found really interesting is over the last 5 years, from 2017 to 2021, there's been $89 billion disaster events, averaging around 17.8, almost 18 events per year. With a cost of $788.4 billion, which averages about $158 billion a year, and almost an average of 900 or so deaths every year from these events. So we've talked about that, like I said in our opening. We've kind of, as a year in review, we've kind of highlighted some of these events, but before we kind of get into these new updates for those folks, and I'll be interested to know this as well, how do you guys go about collecting this data and making these maps that are released at the end of the year, at the end of every year?
We try to capture between our public and private sector partners, and a lot of these are the Federal Science Agency, FEMA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, CDC, Census, the National Interagency Fire Center, the Energy Information Administration, but of course, state climate offices, on the ground, post-disaster reporting is important, and then partners in the private sector like Munich Reinsurance, Swiss Reinsurance, and Property Claim Service. And from all that, I'm sure I left several out. We capture about 15 different asset classes. So, damage to homes, businesses, vehicles, all the contents of those structures, time element losses such as business interruption, or if you're out of your house while it's being rebuilt after a disaster, that's loss of living quarters. But of course, damage to public infrastructure such as roads, bridges, levee systems, the electrical grid, in California when that burnt down, or in southern Louisiana when hurricanes come through the last several years to knock the grid down. Of course, agricultural assets, so it'd be most all the field crops, the livestock feeding costs as those increase with drought, even things like lost hydropower in the West. And let's see, there's probably a few others I'm missing. Damage to the energy platforms in the Gulf of Mexico as the hurricanes disrupt those. But even though that's really a pretty comprehensive total direct loss, so that's insured and uninsured losses, we're still not able to capture a variety of assets such as mental and physical health care related costs. Things like the value of a statistical life. We don't quantify that when people are killed from disasters. Even the downstream supply chain ripple effects outside of a disaster region, we don't capture those. So a lot of the more secondary and tertiary losses, just the data isn't there across space and time consistently enough to bring that into the analysis. But we think it's a strong conservative baseline, the best that we can quantify to this point, but we're always looking for other ways to bring in other types of information if it kind of meets a high threshold.
And looking at these numbers, we go back to the 2010s. From 2010 to 2019, there was an average of 12.8 events per year, $91.9 billion per year, and 523 deaths per year. So we've kind of seen that 10-year period, those numbers, and then you fast forward it to the last 5 years, which kind of takes the back half of these 2010s, and you can really see the exponential growth of what's happening. There's so many factors that can, go into this. What are some of those that you guys are really seeing across the board that's concerning?
Yeah, so the last 5 years in particular, and I would say this year in 2022 is probably more leaning toward the average as opposed to what we've seen from 2017 through 2021, which is just a really anomalous period for so many extremes across much of the country. So quickly, what the different factors, of course, so we have more exposure, people living in harm's way, whether that's on the coast, people living in the river floodplains, or the wildland urban interface. So there's an increased natural, a human risk there that increases our exposure, but our vulnerability is also increased where we build and how we build. In much of the U.S., the building codes are not sufficient to the extremes that we face every year. But as I like to say, climate change is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room as far as what drives some of these extremes to be billion-dollar disasters. So as an example, we've got the mega drought in the West, really since the year 2000, which feeds into these longer, more destructive wildfire seasons. 4 out of the last 5 wildfire seasons, 2017, 2018, 2020, and 2021, have been one order of magnitude more costly than any of the other wildfire years, inflation adjusted to present day dollars. So again, you see that it's kind of a step function difference there as far as our exposure and vulnerability to wildfires predicated on the drought impacts. But then in the East, in the 2010s decade, we had more heavy rain, urban flooding or river basin flooding events during the 2010s than we did in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s combined. Again, all this data is inflation adjusted to present day dollars, including sub-billion-dollar events that are now billion-dollar events just due to inflation. So yeah, exposure, vulnerability, but we know a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor, therefore higher potential for extreme precipitation. And we have seen that, and my gosh, we've had even more in 2022. We're still working on crunching those numbers right now. So, and I guess the final thing would be, yes, this is the 7th consecutive year that we've had in a forecasted above average hurricane season. those poor people and economies along the Gulf of Mexico, particularly in Louisiana. Just so many impacts from the tropical cyclone events.
You're talking about Louisiana. It seems like I can't remember the exact number, but it was like 6 or 7 times in the last year or so that they had been affected by some tropical event. One thing I was wanting to hit on, and Frank, I'll let you jump in whenever. You were talking about the wildfires, and that's something that has really, I don't know, maybe come more to a public forefront. I know we've always had wildfires every year, but it seems like they're getting more coverage, and it seems like it's because they're hitting more populated areas. I think back to Christmas of last year, just north of Denver. I think it was near Boulder where that a fire just erupted, and so many homes and subdivisions were just totally burned in a matter of a couple of hours. And that's scary. That's scary, but it seems like more and more people, as they build homes, are building into more areas that are susceptible of being in wildfires, or along the coast where we're seeing more flooding. So I guess that's playing into it as well, where people are living.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, 4 out of the last 5 wildfire seasons have just been on a whole other level as far as what we've seen any other year. And again, exposure, vulnerability, and the influence of climate on these longer wildfire seasons, or if you even talk to wildfire people on the ground, they say that some of the fires are burning more intensely. And of course, that could also go back to land use. There's more fuel to burn as well. So, it's a really complicated issue. And, I think the question is, how do we mitigate future losses based on what we've learned from these extremes in the past? Because no one wants to keep repeating the same mistakes and pain in lives and livelihoods as we move into the future.
One thing I'm curious about is what your data sources are for some of the information that you put into your $1 billion disaster tool. Just curious where you get your damage estimates from, for example, and perhaps other background information like the socioeconomic data.
So we have about a dozen different public and private sector partners. One of the core ones would be the Property Claims Service, but also we have partners at Munich Reinsurance and Swiss Reinsurance. So it's a lot of they take surveys of hundreds and hundreds of property insurance companies continually around the country for all hazards. And those are also updated. So we also have the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program payout data, USDA Risk Management Agency, which manages the crop insurance part of USDA, the National Interagency Wildfire Center, which is really a clearinghouse for wildfire information such as wildfire suppression costs. And one thing I didn't mention earlier is, so we have all of this public and private sector data across all these different asset classes that I mentioned, which are both insured and uninsured asset classes, even underinsured asset classes. And so we also have another data layer, partly from the private sector, which one of the key first transformations is taking the reciprocal of the insurance penetration rate, which varies by asset class, geography, and hazard type, just based on the way that insurance is structured or other programs are structured. So we're not just putting back out information that has been given to us. There are calculations and algorithms to help quantify. We even run Monte Carlo simulations to calculate the uncertainty surrounding these estimates, which again vary by hazard type and also time away from how mature is the data with the data latency. So there's some real actuarial science behind this, in addition to climatology and other data sources.
Well, Adam, we appreciate that. Frank, I want to. Do you want to do your fun questions before we end up? I don't think we've talked about We haven't talked about Asheville on our fun questions. So.
Yeah, that's true. We've only had one guest from the area, Philippe Pepin. So. We'll do the fun questions here, and hopefully the internet connection holds out. But anyway, these are designed to kind of get to know you and where you're from and where you live a little bit better. So I'm going to ask you, since you live in Asheville, what is something that someone is visiting Western North Carolina has to do? What's sort of a must do when you're visiting?
Well, I could be stereotypical and say go to the Biltmore House, but I think I'll say instead just hop on the Blue Ridge Parkway and find a nice trail and a nice view.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, people come to Asheville for the Biltmore House, but there's a lot more there, and I think that's a good choice. That's number one. Okay, so what's a restaurant that's a must visit while you're in Asheville?
I'm interested to hear
question.
this.
Oh gosh. Well, I would say one thing about Asheville is it's still a relatively smaller size city, but I think it has big city amenities. And by that, I mean, it has almost any type of cuisine you want, it's available. And it's pretty high quality stuff too. There's a Thai place that's pretty good. I think it's called Thai Basil or Pad Thai. Yeah, I don't know. My wife usually orders out for us. And with the pandemic, I haven't actually eaten out at restaurants very recently. Again, maybe another stereotype. Tupelo Honey, even though that's gone to become a chain, I believe it started in Asheville, and it's kind of that Southern style cooking. So I like Tupelo Honey is a pretty good one.
Same question about your hometown, Hickory. What's something that someone has to do when you're visiting Hickory?
Well, so I guess Lake Hickory is kind of a fun place in the summertime in particular. Get out on the water and meet some friends and just hang out. That's a fun spot.
Yeah, you want to mention a restaurant there?
I cannot recall a restaurant there that I've eaten at in a long time, so I'll have to pass on that one.
All right, that's fine. No worries. No worries.
We'll say Bojangles.
Yeah.
There you go.
What is another place in the Carolinas that you enjoy visiting?
I really like going to the Outer Banks, particularly the northeastern part of the state. So, Duck, Nag's Head, it's just so beautiful out there. Culturally, geographically, weather's really beautiful out there. So I like that part of the state in particular. I also like Asheville. So I think North Carolina is it's kind of like a horizontal California. We get a lot of different geography, and you can see it all in one day if you're really aggressive.
That's one of my selling points when people are talking about, well, why do you like North Carolina so much? I was like, theoretically, you could start the day up on a ski slope, and by the end of the day, you can be watching a sunset or out on a surfboard at the coast. It's like, it's one of those states you can get both in, if you really wanted to. So
yeah, you take the Carolinas together and you can get oftentimes you can get any weather regime with just a few hours drive.
Yeah.
When you get one of these cold air damming setups, there can be an ice storm going on in Hickory and a snowstorm in Boone. And you get on the other side of the wedge front, and it's 65 in Columbia and 75 in Charleston, and you can get a little bit of everything.
All right, Frank, is that it? You good?
That's it.
All right, sounds good. Well, Adam, we appreciate you being on with us tonight. Do you have like social media or a website or anything you'd like to promote about this, or anything like that folks can kind of log on to and see?
Yeah, I would just Google U.S. billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. I think it also comes up if you Google weather costs or climate costs. We're always trying to add new tools and functionality and capabilities there and make the data really fun and interactive. That's the point. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't really do Twitter or anything like that, but you can look me up. Again, focusing on weather extremes, costs, impacts, and look forward to hearing from folks.
Sounds good. We appreciate you joining us, and we appreciate all of you who are watching and listening. We hope to see you back here soon on the Carolina Weather Group. Y'all have a